So let's talk about the economics of AI, because everyone is seeing these news articles that come out every day that hundreds of billions of dollars are being dumped into artificial intelligence, whether it's in the form of a capital raise done by OpenAI or Anthropic, or Elon Musk about to go public at a $2 trillion valuation for SpaceX, which is the parent company for XAI. And you can just go on TechCrunch or Bloomberg and you can literally see endless and endless reporting about the enormous capital expenditure that is going into AI and to fuel the AI industry. So it's really interesting because I think we've become desensitized to these gigantic numbers and this news cycle that is consistently bombarding us with more and more basically larger amounts of money doing larger amounts of things. So it could be 1 gigawatts, then 10 gigawatts, then 100 gigawatts. And a lot of people have a tough time creating an overarching view of what's actually transpiring. So I wanted to explain in layman's terms without using a lot of the jargon that most analysts and pundits use to give a simplified explanation of what's going on. We're going to start at the top of the stack, the company that actually is more than any other company today responsible for making sure that AI continues at the trajectory that it does. And so that's a company called ASML. It's literally one company based in the Netherlands. And it's an astonishing company. Most people don't know that it exists. People that do know what it is don't know what they do. People that know what they don't have an understanding of how the scope and the scale of their operation and how their significance to the global technology industry. And it's quite frankly the only part of the tech stack for AI or realistically any other consequential technology that's controlled by a singular company. If there was ever a monopoly, it is actually ASML. So ASML makes the lithography machines that carve, or that is used, but before we even get to carving, that is used by the semiconductor manufacturers like TSMC and Samsung to literally carve into the chips. We're talking about nanometer level chips, the required intelligence or the required circuitry to make the chip work. So again, I will in the future do an entire show on ASML and this incredible lithography technology that is like literally at the cutting edge. If you want to know who is at the cutting edge of physics, that they're pushing humanity's capacity to manipulate the physical world to its utmost extreme, it's ASML. The things they're doing is preposterous. Just to give you some idea, their machines cost somewhere in the several hundreds of millions of dollars per machine. So it's like $100 to $300 million per machine. And they have customers, not that many, but the biggest companies in the world, TSMC, Samsung, that are Huawei, although they can't really sell to them, waiting to buy these. And I think they're delivering like 2 a year because these machines are preposterous. They require hundreds of people to disassemble and assemble. They're made in what can only be called like something out of science fiction facilities where like oxygen and it's incredible. Like dust is not allowed. And it's unbelievable. We'll do a whole video on it, but just understand it as it is the input factor. It's the machine that's required to make semiconductors, to make chips, to make these very important chips, to make the most bleeding edge, latest, tiny nanometer chips that's required for AI. So these guys have a monopoly on this machine. Now, you would wonder actually as a kind of slight offshoot to that, why doesn't the government break them up? First of all, they're not an American company, which is so fascinating. They're the only company, one of 2 companies on this list that's not an American company. Number 2, they're based in the Netherlands. And number 2, they're a monopoly, not by choice. It's not like they bent the market and strong-armed the customer and created a cartel to create this monopoly. No, they're just the only ones that can actually build this. They are so unique, so sophisticated, so particularly specialized that they welcome competition. And there are people that are now claiming they can compete with ASML. And I feel that there is some Chinese competitor to ASML that we don't know about. But there isn't an ASML competitor that's delivering these lithography machines at scale to the biggest companies in the world in the way that ASML is. So they're at the top of the stack. They make a couple $100 per machine, immensely profitable. But they have a functional constraint, which is they can't make that many machines a year. It's just not possible. It's literally the polar opposite of a mass market product. It is the most non-mass market product. It is the antithesis of a mass market product to the fact that they can only sell a couple a year, no matter what the demand is for their product. Now, mind you, the value of the product they create is incalculable. It's so big, but there's not that many people that can afford to buy these machines either. It's a very particular type of person that buys it. So now let's go to the second character, the second rung in the AI supply chain, which is the semiconductor manufacturers. Now, this used to be an ample group of people. In the early 2010s, there used to be a bunch of players in this game, especially one of the legacy companies that really fallen off that's trying to make a comeback, which is Intel. There's a lot of players in this game. And now there is one. That's not exactly true. There's Samsung, there's Intel, there's a couple of other competitors, which are realistically not worth mentioning in a general purpose video like this. But when I do my deep dive into semiconductors, I'll definitely cover all of them. And then there's this King Kong in the semiconductor industry, which is called TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. And they're based in Taiwan. And if you've ever heard or watched the geopolitical conversation around Taiwan as to why Taiwan is a national security interest to the entire world, primarily the United States, and why the US cannot allow China to overtake Taiwan, they always say it's because Taiwan makes the chips. Taiwan makes the chips. And so that's true. It's actually true and it's an incredible story. The story of TSMC is one of the most wild stories in all of business. Morris Chang was the founder of TSMC, incredible entrepreneur, started TSMC very late in his career after getting rejected for the CEO of Texas Instruments role, started with collaboration with the Taiwanese government at a time when nothing important was being made in Taiwan, and has over the last 20 plus years built this behemoth with these experts, with this manufacturing capacity to make the latest in chips. Chips are valued or are evaluated based on how small they are, not how big they are. So the latest chip is always the smallest nanometer chip. And that's as far as you need to understand. Just understand the latest chip, the one on the cutting edge, the one that's going to be used in the most sophisticated parts of AI training and inference and computing is being made by TSMC. Everyone else is making a bigger and less valuable chip. Still important. You have chips now being made all over the world that are being used in important but mundane use cases because there's computation in everything now. So your microwave, your television, a lot of car chips. Companies all over the world can make those. But you want to talk about the leading edge, the edge that is going to make the difference for an AI company, it's TSMC. Not to mention, the biggest customer of TSMC is Apple. And so Apple's entire M line of what they've now internalized used to be with Intel, but Apple has now internalized. Those chips come from TSMC and then put into the Apple silicon. So the demand for TSMC is insane. It's bigger than the demand for ASML. TSMC, of course, is the biggest ASML customer along with Samsung. Samsung is catching up to TSMC. Still, it's not a catch-up type of thing. It's like if you need to catch up, you're 3 years behind type of thing because it's so difficult to get these fabrication plants up and running. And so much is put into the nuances of these chip design, not to mention the relationship with ASML that we've been able to procure this machine. Anyway, TSMC sells to everybody. That's important. Apple, I mentioned, but the other company they sell is probably the first company on this list that you've heard of, which is Nvidia. So we've gone from ASML, they make the lithography machines that are used to create chips. Those machines are sold to TSMC. TSMC has these fabrication plants where they use ASML's machine and create these cutting edge, smallest of nanometer chips. Who do they sell these chips to? Apple, and every hardware manufacturer is a customer. Broadcom, everybody is a customer of TSMC. In a bizarre way, Samsung is also a customer of TSMC and a competitor of TSMC. But nonetheless, the biggest customer of TSMC is Apple, but the biggest player, the one that's AI specific, the next rung in this AI supply chain, is a company that you guys would have all heard, because over the last 3 years, they've become the most valuable company in the world. They've built the greatest business of all time till date. Maybe SpaceX will overtake that. Maybe Anthropic will overtake that. But as of today, they're a cash-guzzling, money-printing, quasi-government institution titled Nvidia. Another incredible story, another once-in-a-generation entrepreneur in Jensen Huang, who has worked 2 jobs in his life as a server at Denny's, if I'm not mistaken, and the CEO and founder of Nvidia, which he has run since the 1990s. And Nvidia has had an incredibly tumultuous path to global dominance. They started off with a real focus on what would essentially become the gaming industry. And Jensen's kind of real insight there was there's going to be these GPUs, graphics cards, these things that are going to be important. These are application-specific computers where you had kind of Intel, AMD, they dominated personal computing. Jensen said, we're going to make application-specific computers. I'm terribly simplifying the story of NVIDIA here. Nonetheless, it was these application-specific computers that the early AI scientists, early meaning in the latest rendition of AI from the 2010s, decided to train and run their LLMs on. Jensen calls this one of these moments where some scientists that were participating in a competition at the University of Toronto to be able to create a large language model that could essentially do computer vision better than others. And they, funny story, walked across the street to Best Buy to buy some Nvidia GPUs because they felt that was actually the best system to run their model on. And it worked, and they won that competition. And Jensen calls that day the Big Bang. It was in the early 2010s, because that was the day that solidified, or that kicked off, that NVIDIA would be the hardware manufacturer for the AI revolution. So NVIDIA buys chips from TSMC, and they create GPUs of all different types with variations in capacity, and these H100s, H200s, Blackwells, the list goes on. They've created so many permutations, so many game-changing hardware releases, and they've built their own software language, CUDA, which then allows programmers to work on the hardware and write applications on the hardware in a concurrent manner, where you're essentially running multiple LLMs on multiple NVIDIA GPUs and piling them together to be able to create the next rung in the supply chain for AI, which is the large language model labs. Mind you, there's a little bit, because the large language model labs, OpenAI, Anthropic, XAI, Gemini, are actually the consumers of NVIDIA's GPU. There is, however, a little bit of a character that plays a role in there, which are called the hyperscalers. These are companies that have emerged because the large language model, the LLM labs have the demand for GPUs, but they don't want to be in the business of constructing these data centers to be able to run these GPUs 24/7, which is what they need to be able to facilitate their training clusters to run their models, to train their models, or to now to do inference. Whatever the case may be, the LLM companies didn't want to do that. Anthropic today still doesn't do that. ChatGPT has gone on to start, OpenAI started to do it a little bit. Google and XA have a little bit different models here, but nonetheless, all four of these guys are the consumers of the Nvidia GPUs, along with some of their Chinese counterparts, which are also consumers of the Nvidia GPUs. It's incredible that Nvidia still has a stranglehold on this market. Of course, when you become a $4 trillion company, you do not do it without attracting competitors. So AMD, Intel, everybody is now chomping at the bit to say, how do we catch up? With that being said, their middle character here between Nvidia and the LLM companies are the hyperscalers, the data center companies. So this is, who are the hyperscalers? The hyperscalers in the pre-AI world were AWS, Google Cloud, GCP, and Microsoft Azure, who are essentially buying regular computers and putting them all into a highly efficient, electricity efficient, cooling, temperature managed data center of data centers across the world, and then feeding you this compute infrastructure, feeding companies the compute infrastructure over the internet so that you didn't have to run your own mainframe in your office when you started a business. That was what we call the hyperscalers. They were called hyperscalers because essentially they were a good proxy for the computational consumption of the entire market. And so they grew enormously quickly. That's why they're also scaling in a hyper manner. And when the AI revolution took over, they became intermediaries between Nvidia and the LLM companies. So they went and gobbled up as much GPUs as they can. And this is why, just like TSMC and just like ASML, Nvidia cannot make enough computers to actually service the demand that they have. Every hyperscaler on the market except Google, which we will come back to, but even Google has purchased billions, tens of billions, if I'm not mistaken, hundreds of billions of dollars of Nvidia GPUs, not to just use for themselves, but to create this infrastructure as a service, create these rooms, they're not little, gigantic rooms with thousands of Nvidia GPUs that can then be given or rented over the internet to the LLM model so that they don't have to worry about doing this because there's enormous capex, enormous real estate, enormous power. They got to go negotiate, they have to construct these enormous buildings and rent it to the LLM guys because the LLM guys' appetite for compute, which happens vis-a-vis the NVIDIA GPUs, is insatiable. So just remember these companies that are the hyperscalers. You have the most pure play hyperscaler, which is AWS, Amazon Web Services. Why I call them pure play is because they truly are a cloud business. They buy hardware for someone else, although they're starting their own hardware manufacturing like all of these guys will. And they rent it to mostly, almost exclusively other companies. You have Microsoft Azure, who's an interesting player here because Microsoft also buys hardware from Nvidia and some other places, but Nvidia, and rents it almost exclusively to other companies, but they have a horse in this race, which is OpenAI, because they were the first real big money investor into OpenAI, which we will break down that deal in another episode. But they have a horse in this race. And it's very interesting how that relationship plays out. But they also sell that compute infrastructure to OpenAI's competitors and other people. You have Google, who is the most interesting character in this concoction because Google is the only company that also makes hardware. So they make the competitor to NVIDIA's GPUs, which they call TPUs. So they also manufacture hardware. They also buy NVIDIA's hardware. They also have a cloud business, which they also sell to other companies, which they also use to train Gemini, because they also have a model. They're the only company here that has their own LLM lab. And then, of course, you have the most recent entrant into the space, which is xAI, Elon Musk's company, which until now was a model company, but with the SpaceX play is now, or realistically with Colossus and all these other data centers that xAI started to build. The conceptual idea is that is xAI as a singular model going to consume all this, or are we also going to become a hyperscaler and essentially, as a joke I heard the other day, start EWS, Elon Web Services, and become a hyperscaler as well, which is exactly what they've done. So two of these four players have their own models. Microsoft has a horse in this race, even though they don't have their own model, they have a horse in their race with OpenAI, and AWS really has neither a horse in this race, and they're the more pure play. On top of this, there are all these other smaller characters, such as Snowflake, And these are just traditional cloud computing companies that were never hyperscalers, but are taking advantage of the way that the AI revolution has transpired. Snowflake is a great example. And what they do is they are more of a conventional infrastructure as a service and real estate play, where they're building data centers, usually based on financial instrumentation, where they can take debt and they have the customers ready because the demand is insatiable. Me and you can start a company tomorrow and the demand will be there if you can build the data center and issue the compute. But there are those companies as well, but they're not really worth mentioning with these hyperscalers. You also have one other character who is very interesting, which is Meta, who's also a gigantic customer of Nvidia, who's also a hyperscaler, but unlike the other four, they exclusively use their compute, which is large, their data centers enormous, for servicing Meta infrastructure for their own products. So that's why they include them in the other four, because they don't really have a commercial business selling compute. To the next rung in this pyramid, which is the AI model companies. This is OpenAI, Anthropic, xAI, Gemini. Remember, xAI and Gemini are also on the previous layer, but OpenAI and Anthropic are pure play model companies. And then in China, you have your DeepSeek, which is open source. You have Meta's Llama in the US, which is open source. You have a bunch of open source options. And you have some closed source options in China as well. But let's just keep it for the US ones for this sake. The LLM companies they don't want to be caught up in this mess. You have to really think about the LLM companies as they're the child that this entire orchestra is trying to feed. Why I call them a child is because A, they're new relative to these other companies, but B, because they're just like consumptive. They're just like, feed me, give me milk, give me food, give me stuff, give me compute. And I have a use case for it that I'm creating out of thin air in terms of it wasn't there before a decade ago, and I've created it in the form of these chatbots or this agentic models or all these models that stable diffusion models, all these models that the public will buy. And so they've created these incredible models from ChatGPT to Claude to Gemini to Gemma is another one from Google to Grok with xAI. Kimi, it's a Chinese one. These are the models. Their companies are the ones I named before. They rent usually the compute from the hyperscalers. In some cases, they do their own infrastructure and do the deal directly with Nvidia or AMD, and they transform compute into intelligence vis-a-vis their model and offer it to the public, which is where you guys first will interact with any of these characters, where you will use ChatGPT or Claude, and you will potentially use the free version with ads, or you will pay OpenAI or Anthropic or whatever, Gemini, to use that intelligence to make your life more productive, or maybe to generate income. But first, or some reason to save time, to save money, you as the public, whether you're a business owner or you are an individual, need to buy this intelligence a la carte from the model companies. And there's just one problem with this entire beautiful, and now you can see there's circular financing, there's AMD, OpenAI owning AMD stock, Nvidia opening OpenAI stock, Amazon owning Claude stock, Anthropic stock, Google just invested into Anthropic. Meanwhile, they're all competing. It's a mess. They're all betting on one thing, though. They're betting that the model companies will have an increase in demand for compute, which they do. There's no debate about it, which is then going to funnel. You can think of the model companies are here. Behind it is everything I just mentioned, all the way to ASML. So the increase in compute demand is there for the foreseeable future and growing at some ungodly rate. So the money from the model companies is being flushed back to all these players, and they're all getting rich. The question is, where is the money coming from to the model companies? So in some cases, they're raising the money. In a lot of cases, they're getting it in the form of credits from a lot of these hyperscalers, which is hilarious. And in some cases, especially with the recent boom in Anthropic with Claude, they're just getting it from their customers. The problemo is, let's just give them the benefit of the doubt and say they're getting it all from their customers. And Anthropic is going to rule the day, and OpenAI is going to rule the day, and customers are going to pour as they are with at least Anthropic, billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars into Anthropic because this intelligence that their Anthropic gives in the form of Claude is so useful. I pay for Claude. My company pays for Claude. We cannot live without Claude. We cannot live without Gemini. I can't personally live without ChatGPT. However, there's a little caveat. So who's the budget? The budget for these LLM companies, the income for these LLM companies are all from companies. They're not from individuals. Google and ChatGPT are going to try to figure out consumer. They're going to figure out what the end customer's version of this AI is going to be. Google can bundle it with the rest of their kind of googly services because people already use all of them and have an inherent, they have a gateway to the people's data with the existing services. Meta and Google, apart from that, will use it to make their ads efficient, which is actually probably the most profitable use case of AI today. ChatGPT has the best consumer base so far. They have the most amount of regular non-business users paying for their services and also not paying for their services. But Claude has proven that none of that matters. You can put all of consumer in a bin and throw it to the wayside because what matters is business usage. And Claude runs business usage primarily through their products Claude Code and Claude Cowork. And here is an interesting question and where I wanted to leave you guys off with today. The businesses that are paying for Claude and will eventually pay for Codex and everything from OpenAI, are they making money with this or are they just losing money with this? Clearly, Claude is able to flip for the first time. We're seeing it. Flip this gigantic investment that it took to get Anthropic running and fed all the people behind them who already got rich, but it's now Anthropic's turn to get rich because the demand for Claude Code is so great and they've built one of the greatest products in human history and they cannot offer it fast enough. People are eating it up. But are those people that are eating it up making money or are they hoping to make money? Claude is now making money. Anthropic is now making the profit that they promised their investors. It is not a scam. The model companies, at least Anthropic has proven, we can pull it off. We can actually, forget about pulling it off, we can build one of the great businesses of all time in terms of free cash flow. But that entire bet is made on the fact that the companies that are buying Claude tokens, by the way, tokens are when you convert this hardware, this processing power that comes from the hardware side of this equation through the LLMs, what your output is these things called tokens, LLM tokens. And these tokens are what's sold. They're the unit of intelligence that is then sold, monetized per token, a lot of times per API call to the LLM company. So you can just think of tokens as like the unit of measuring the consumption of AI. And Claude sells a lot of these tokens. My company, tiny little company, cannot that just run out of tokens immediately because of how much we use it. However, are we, or is anyone that's spending money with Claude capable of converting that into further profits for ourselves? If we are not, and I'm going to make an entire video of why we are not, but if we are not, then this becomes a deflationary activity, meaning the end customer is paying for something. Businesses, by the way, not retail users, we haven't even gone to that, are paying for something that doesn't actually grow their business. It could still be valuable if it helps them save money. I believe it can help them grow money, but that's only, I'm talking my own book, if it's something like an Earn GPT or an ads product that can come out of this AI revolution. But if it's something that cannot just, Salesforce CEO recently said, his company's going to spend $300 million on Claude tokens this year. That's one customer for Claude, for Anthropic. $300 million. Can Salesforce use that to make more than $300 million? Is it going to increase Salesforce's bottom line by $300 million? Maybe. Maybe not. And we will find out in the following episode what it looks like on the other side of this equation. I hope you understood the supply chain that makes AI work. ASML, TSMC, Nvidia, the hyperscalers, the LLMs, and the application businesses or the companies that buy those tokens. I will see what these companies that are buying the tokens can do with them in the following episode.